Situated along the waters of the Chesapeake Bay, Portsmouth, Virginia is a seaport town, home to the US Navy and Coast Guard. Naval officers and their families reside along the tree-lined streets. One of these was the family of Navy officer Chris Short, who lived with his wife Angela and his 3 stepchildren, Elizabeth, Meghan, and Corey Landowski. After having lived in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for a year, where Chris had been stationed, the family were relieved when he was transferred to a naval hospital in Portsmouth. The oldest of the children, 16-year-old Meghan Landowski, immediately enrolled in dance classes. She excelled and proved to be a natural, described by her mother as beautiful, friendly, and talented. Meghan had settled into her new school, Woodrow Wilson High School, very quickly. Her classmates were drawn to her magnetic personality, and she had no problems at all with making friends. Thursday the 10th of April 2008 began as a typical sunny spring day. Meghan had woke up early and spent a while talking to her mother about a test that she had that day, before being dropped off at school. The pair exchanged goodbyes and parted ways. Little did Angela know was that this would be the last time that she would ever see her daughter alive. Around 4 p.m. that afternoon, Meghan's stepfather Chris arrived back to the family home. He noticed that the door was open but was not concerned. Meghan had been told several times by her parents not to leave the front door open. Chris entered the home with the intentions of having a stern word with his daughter. He began calling her name, but silence rang throughout the home. As he entered the kitchen, he made a horrifying discovery. His daughter Meghan lay lifeless on the floor. She had been murdered. Chris later commented that she looked like a China doll just laying there, staring out into space. Portsmouth resident Detective Doug Funkhauser was on his way to his anniversary dinner with his wife when he received a phone call that a young lady in town had been killed. He made his way over to Robert Court and was met with a gruesome scene. As he approached the front door, he noticed blood on the door handle. He made his way into the kitchen, where he found the teenager's partially nude body strewn across the floor. Meghan was laying in a large pool of blood and had multiple stab wounds to her back, neck, face and throat. Her mouth had also been taped shut. Even for a seasoned detective, this was one of the most brutal that Detective Funkhauser had ever seen. It also struck him harder as the victim was a child. He immediately thought of his own 3 children and vowed to get justice. It was quickly established that the killer had not been invited into the home by Meghan, and that he had gained entry via the first-floor window. Once inside, the attack had begun in an upstairs bedroom. The bed was messed up as though a struggle had taken place. Under the left corner of the bed, there was a tape dispenser. It appeared to be the same size tape as the one that was wrapped around Meghan's arms and face. As the forensics team searched even more, the evidence found in the bedroom got more disturbing. Seminal fluid was found on the duvet and in Meghan's underwear. It appeared that Meghan had been sexually assaulted before her brutal murder downstairs. It did not take long before the potential murder weapon was also discovered. The forensics team noticed that a knife was missing from the holder on the kitchen counter. This knife was soon found in the sink. Law enforcement knew that they had to catch the killer fast. The investigation began immediately, with police going door to door trying to find witnesses who may have seen or heard anything suspicious around the time of the murder. Amazingly, nobody had noticed anything. It seemed that the murderer was able to slip out in broad daylight unnoticed. Fear swept throughout the town, and parents were scared for their own children, most of whom were too terrified to sleep at night, knowing that there was a killer on the loose. After the initial shock of their daughter's murder, Angela and Chris told police that they believed they knew who the suspect was. They named a former friend with a dark history. When Meghan had just turned 16, she had been sexually assaulted by her stepfather's Navy buddy, Keith Camp. Meghan's parents had pressed charges just 5 months before her murder, and a trial was pending. They believed that Keith had murdered Meghan to prevent her from testifying against him, as this would not only ruin his reputation, but could land him in jail. Meghan had expressed concerns that he would come after her, and now it looked as though her fears had come true. Officers were dispatched to Keith's home to conduct a search, but unfortunately, no incriminating evidence could be found that could tie him to the murder. His computer was later searched, however, and a recently deleted file was discovered. This file contained child pornography. With this discovery, Keith now became the number one suspect. He was taken in for questioning and confronted about the murder. Police had hoped he would confess. He was visibly nervous during his interview, but claimed that he had been at the Navy base the entire day that Meghan was murdered. After corroborating his timeline with colleagues, police realised that he could have snuck away from the base, committed the murder, and then returned. They took a swab of Keith's DNA to compare to the DNA found at the scene of the murder. The results would leave everyone flabbergasted. It was not a match. Keith was not Meghan's killer. This was devastating for officers who were now back to square one. They had no leads and no suspects. This was until they turned their attention to Chris, Meghan's stepfather, who had discovered her body. A DNA sample was taken, and this quickly ruled him out as a suspect. They also went on to eliminate all of her family members, including her younger brother Corey. An autopsy later discovered the extent of the murder. Meghan had been stabbed in what was described as overkill. It seemed that whoever had killed Meghan had been extremely angry, but why? This was more than likely someone who had known the victim, but Meghan was a well-loved girl who had no enemies, so who would want to take her life in such a horrific way? With no suspects, Meghan's parents began to worry that her case would go unsolved, and they would not see justice for their daughter. Detectives began to take a more extended look into Meghan's school life. They did not want to rule out the possibility of a secret boyfriend, an admirer, or an enemy at her school who could have brought harm to her. They questioned Meghan's close friend, Heather Corey, to see if she could provide insight into any potential suspects, but unfortunately, she could not. Police interviewed other friends from Woodrow Wilson High School, and it was here that they discovered that Meghan had a few romantic partners, but nothing serious. None of these boys were considered suspects, but just to be sure, police took DNA samples to rule them out. Biogeographical forensic investigators examined the DNA that was collected from the crime scene once again, to try and determine where in the world the killer had come from. They determined that they were looking for an African American male. 6 months passed with no major breaks in the case. Then one day, a helpful classmate shared with police some information. It was a list of names of boys that Meghan had sometimes flirted with. When police looked at the list, all but one of these individuals had been interviewed. This was 16-year-old Robert Barnes. Meghan had also enrolled in a performing arts program at Churchland High School. Robert Barnes was also an attendee of this high school. Meghan had once confided in her friend Heather that she believed Robert liked her as more than a friend, but she did not reciprocate those feelings. Robert Barnes was a gifted violinist who was described as a good student who never had any problems in school and was not a troublemaker. Police tracked him down to question him about Meghan. The interview was very typical and similar to every other interview conducted. Robert told investigators that Meghan was a nice girl, and he could not think of anyone who would want to harm her. Police did not suspect anything out of the ordinary until the end of the interview. Robert was asked if he minded giving a DNA sample. After thinking for a moment, he refused. This struck the investigators as odd. Every other classmate of Meghan's had been more than happy to cooperate. Robert went on to politely explain that his mother would not agree to it, to which police stated that he did not need parental consent as he had now turned 17. He was very capable of consenting on his own. Robert once again declined. Investigators could not ignore their intuition that something was not quite right with Robert Barnes. Once the interview ended, investigators told him to ask his mother for consent and contact them again. The next day, investigators received a call from Robert asking to meet. An investigator asked Robert if he had asked his mother. He replied, "No, but you can have my bubblegum." With that, Robert took the bubblegum out of his mouth and placed it in a latex glove, before handing it over to investigators. Despite his change of heart, investigators still felt that Robert was hiding something. Soon enough, the detective received a call from the lab where the bubblegum had been sent. They wanted to know where the sample had come from. After the investigator told them that he had watched Robert spit the gum into the glove, they asked if he was sure he had watched Robert the entire time. The DNA sample had come back as a match to a female. It did not belong to Robert Barnes. Robert had switched the gum that he was chewing with another piece of gum that he had given as a sample. He was brought in for questioning once again to be confronted with the DNA results. During this interview, Robert slipped up when he made the comment. This happened on a Thursday. Nobody who the police had interviewed up to that point had known the exact date of the murder. When officers mentioned this to him, he came up with a ridiculous explanation. He claimed that on that day, Meghan had asked him to come by her house. He claimed that once he got there, he realised that Meghan was not home alone and was being held at gunpoint by a masked man. According to Robert, the man turned the gun on him and made him tie Meghan up. He then claimed that he was forced to sexually assault Meghan. Afterwards, he claimed that they all went downstairs and the gunman grabbed a knife and began to stab Meghan. He said that the killer then grabbed his hand and cut him, so that his blood would also be found at the scene. Robert had tried to pin himself as a victim, whilst trying to explain away any evidence that could link him to the crime. But police were not buying his story. Robert Barnes was arrested for the murder of Meghan Landowski. Meghan's parents were stunned to hear that the quiet young boy who used to ride the bus with their daughter had been capable of such violence. Police believed that Robert had entered the home via the window that afternoon. He surprised Meghan in her bedroom before committing the sexual assault. At some point she had escaped and ran downstairs before Robert caught up to her and stabbed her with the kitchen knife, continuing to stab her even after she was deceased. He then left the residence and continued on with his life as though nothing had happened. His trial commenced in September of 2009. Robert pled guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated sexual battery. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison.